If you have ever heard me speak before, you know I say the three most important things in any compliance program are the following. Document. Now have to have documented every step in your investigative process. So we're going to take you up to actually doing the investigation, because the protocol you put in place is what's going to protect you and give you information that allow you to move from simply a detect or reactive mode to a prevent or proactive mode.
This is Tom Fox. We take things in a little bit different direction today, as for this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, I post the webinar I did for eyesight on your investigative protocol in the wake of the Monaco Memo. We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back.
The question is, how confident are you in your ability to respond to a harassment complaint effectively? And the answers are very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or panicked. 31% say very confident, 55% say somewhat confident, 12% say not very confident, and 0% say panicked.
I'm glad it's 0% are panicked. But why I wanted to visit with you today, and what we're really going to focus on today, is the following. When Eyesight contacted me about perhaps working together on a webinar, they said, what's new and different that we really need to focus on, Tom? And I said, what's new and different is one of the most basic skills and requirements in any compliance program, and that's investigations. And they were intrigued, and they said, why? And I said, name any compliance program in any discipline: HR, anti-corruption compliance, anti-money laundering compliance, export control, trade sanctions, anti-harassment. You name the law or the legal requirement. The requirements around investigations are even more important today. And it really is a culmination of several different factors, but the catalyst was a speech by Lisa Monaco in October of 2021. Lisa Monaco is the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And in this speech, she reinstituted something called the Yates Memo. And the Yates Memo was announced back in 2015. It was modified under the Trump administration. It came in under the previous Obama administration. But the Yates Memo said that companies had to turn over all information on when they do an investigation and come to the government with the results of that investigation of wrongdoers, not just those who the company thought may have been culpable, not just those who were directly involved, but all information. And that really put an incredible focus on investigations. Second, and I should emphasize, this is not limited to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is my expertise, or HR, or any other legal requirement. It is all investigations where you have to work with a U.S. government regulator. So it applies to literally every form of investigation you can think of. The second is a case called United States versus Corbin. And this is a case where a company called Cognizant Technologies was informed that they had C-suite level involvement in a bribery and corruption scheme of the COO and the general counsel, the CFO and the general counsel. And the company, within 2 weeks of being notified of this, the board of directors self-disclosed to the Department of Justice. And then through their ongoing investigation, ongoing remediation, and early self-disclosure, the company, Cognizant Technologies, actually escaped with a non-prosecution agreement, or a declination. That means they got a free pass, even though they literally had C-suite involvement in the bribery scheme. Corbin is the criminal case that came out of the two C-suite individuals. And so that criminal case is percolating along, and there came a huge fight over the internal investigation done by the company. And the judge ruled that the Department of Justice and Cognizant Technology had to turn over not only the report about the investigation, the report of the findings, all work papers, all attorney notes, all attorney thought process, all evidence. In other words, everything involving the investigation up to and including the presentation by company lawyers to the Department of Justice. Now, that is in criminal litigation, but those criminal defense attorneys for Coburn and his co-defendant will be picking apart that investigation in a way that probably the people who did the investigation did not anticipate. Next is the Caremark doctrine. Now, this is a doctrine that comes to us from the courts of Delaware, and it really deals with boards of directors. But it deals with boards of directors who have either abrogated their obligation to oversee compliance or have not fulfilled it because senior management lied to them, didn't give them the information, or something similar to that. And what it has created is a separate obligation for boards, if information comes forward about significant matters that violate the law, have to institute their own investigation above and beyond what the company already. And literally the best example I can point you to is ripped from the headlines this week, where a former Twitter executive, won't try to pronounce his full name, but he goes by the moniker Mudge, filed a whistleblower complaint and said that the CEO of Twitter kept information from the board of directors that he uncovered that nefarious activities were going on. And finally, on this list, I think everyone is familiar with the SEC whistleblower program. It's now paid out over multi-billion dollars in benefits. It's a huge success. And 85 to 90% of all whistleblowers who go to the Securities and Exchange Commission have internally reported first. What does that mean? That means either the company didn't take their allegations seriously, they dropped the ball, they didn't investigate, they didn't take the reporters, the whistleblowers' allegations and remedy the situation such that the whistleblower went to the Securities and Exchange Commission and received a bounty or a part of the whistleblowers' awards. That program has been around since 2012, I think, came into being with the Dodd-Frank legislation. But now we've had this, the program has been such a success, it's expanded to multiple other departments and agencies within the United States government. And the anti-money laundering law of 2020 specifically created a whistleblower program for OFAC and the CFTC and the Department of Treasury. One of the most interesting fallouts or unintended consequences might be the better phrase from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and probably the most ubiquitous picture in the early part of the war was Russian oligarchs' yachts trying to steam to ports where they could not have the yachts seized after sanctions were imposed on them by the Biden administration as a result of the Russian invasion. There became a huge cottage industry of maritime experts looking for those yachts and reporting that information to the Department of Treasury and OFAC. In other words, they became whistleblowers. Why? Because they were incentivized to do so under this AML law of 2020 that created whistleblower bounties for the Department of Treasury, for OFAC, and for the CFTC. Whistleblowing has become a very favored and popular within the U.S. government. And once again, the same issues that arose under the SEC whistleblower program, which is in many of these situations, employees are internally reporting first, but for whatever reason, no one's taking their allegations seriously. So for all of these reasons, I think something that has been as important as any other part of your compliance program for 20 years, 30 years, is even more important today. And so when ISI said, what do you think the forward cutting edge topics are? I said, I think it's back to the future, that we need to refocus our efforts and our thought processes on the internal investigation. So today's webinar, we're going to focus on everything up your doing the investigation. In other words, your investigative protocol. And one of the things I really want to emphasize, and I will continue to emphasize throughout this webinar, is that you need to have a system in place, whether you call that a case management system, whether it is a case management system, but you have to have a systemic process in place that has oversight, that documents everything you can do, that can be tested or audited against. And most importantly, if the Department of Justice comes knocking, if a defense attorney in a criminal trial sends a subpoena, or if a whistleblower goes to one of these new agencies, that you have a documented process and you can show them the steps you have taken, your decision-making process behind those steps in a documented fashion. If you have ever heard me speak before, you know I say the three most important things in any compliance program are the following. Document. Well, you now have to have documented every step in your investigative process. So we're going to take you up to actually doing the investigation, because the protocol you put in place is what's going to protect you and give you information that allow you to move from simply a detect or reactive mode to a prevent or proactive mode. Victoria, if we could go to the next slide. Where does it all start? If you're of a certain age, of which I am, you remember the television show MASH. And certainly you may have seen the movie MASH, but the television show ran for I don't know how many years. And I've watched almost all of those. So triage is a concept that I've certainly heard in popular culture for a long time. But triage is equally important in your investigative protocol. What that means is that you need to thoroughly review any whistleblower report that comes in, and then you need to assign it to an appropriate level of investigative protocol within your organization. So these 5 steps are laid out in the white paper that you'll receive after this webinar today, and I give a lot more color and breadth and scope to these, so you'll get more information. But these are the highlights, and I have to acknowledge my colleague Jonathan Marks at Baker Tilly, who developed these 5 steps. So shout out to Jonathan for this and allowing me to cite to his 5 steps, or he calls them the 5 stages of triage. And what are they? Well, number 1, these are allegations that have a low threat level and don't suggest a breakdown of internal controls. It's an internal auditor type, so you'll hear information and you'll hear terminology that an auditor would use around internal controls. Stage 2, these allegations are more serious in nature and often indicate some deficiency in the design of your controls. Stage allegations are serious once again, but these involve an override of internal controls and thus are at a minimum of a serious deficiency. It's certainly one thing to have a deficiency in your internal controls, but if you start to have override of your internal controls, you really move into another level or another stage, as Jonathan would. Stage 4, these are serious allegations that could have an impact on the completeness and accuracy of a financial statement. If there are any internal auditors or CFO types on this webinar, you know that a restatement is the absolute biggest disaster you can have. And you've got to have audited financial statements that everyone has confidence in, both internally and externally. And if you have a stage 4 issue, that could certainly indicate a material weakness in your internal controls. And if you have a material weakness, you have to disclose that publicly. And stage 5, these are serious enough allegations in terms of the breadth and scope, or involves members of a senior management team, or could damage the company's reputation. These are the 5 stages of triage. This is what you look at when a complaint comes in, a whistleblower report is made, somebody goes into a supervisor's office and presents information. Obviously, you have to have an appropriate intake mechanism, whether that's an automated system, whether that's an informal reporting. But if you have that more informal reporting system where you have a true speak up culture in an organization where employees are empowered to go talk to their supervisors, you need to have a way to get that information to compliance, get that information to legal, get that information to the head of HR, whoever the point person is. And there should be one point person presented or nominated rather to get these allegations and perform these initial triage. One of the other things we have heard the Department of Justice talk about consistently since 2016 is, do your employees have training to do the job? So whoever you appoint or handles the triage needs to have the ability to actually perform that. And we're going to talk about that concept really throughout these, but the Department of Justice is beginning to focus on the training of individual compliance professionals in the context of what they did leading up to facts and circumstances after the information came in. So this is extremely important. And I probably should have added in the prior slide, one of the additional reasons that investigations have become even more important, even though they've been around obviously since time immemorial, is that if you become a recidivist, the penalties against you can be strikingly higher. And here we look to the Swedish company Ericsson, who had a FCPA violation, a $1 billion plus fine, a deferred prosecution agreement, a monitor, and in the face of all of that, some 2 years later, announced we found another. Obviously, the question is, why wasn't this found during all of the other investigations? Why wasn't it reported? And we can debate all of those questions. But the point is, the investigative protocol that Ericsson had in place was insufficient to uncover this second bribery scandal. And the Department of Justice is obviously very concerned about this. They're very concerned about the entire culture. But for you who are on the front lines or may have a role in investigation, even more pressure to get it right. So could we move to the next slide, please, Victoria?
Yes, we actually have a question as well. So is there a general or common breakdown of what percentages of complaints fall into each category? So what percentages of would typically fall into stages 4 or 5, for example?
So I've only got anecdotal information on something, a question like that. Most of the reports are going to be stage 1, and then decreasing amount of more serious reports come in. Hopefully, when you get to stage 4 or 5, it's a very low number, because 5 could be a criminal matter, or if you have the company's senior management involved. And then 4 is, I tried to emphasize that you certainly don't want to restate your audited financial statements. And so it's not a criminal violation, at least I hope it's not, but it's typically not the stage 5, but it could be a little bit more common because it's not a true criminal violation. But typically there would be an decreasing numbers as you go down from stages 1 to 5, but there's no one source of information I can point a question or two which would give us that precise information. So what is your investigation protocol? And here I would really ask you to think through, do you have an investigation protocol written? Do you have a policy and procedure already in place? The last thing you want to do is try to make this up on the fly. So say a stage 4, stage 5 comes in from the prior slide, you certainly don't want to be in the position of trying to make up your protocol. This protocol comes to us, which I think is really going to be very helpful for a couple of different reasons. One, it is aimed for the more routine investigation, but it gives you the same rigor that you would approach a much more serious problem. And it keeps everyone on the same page, meaning that if you have rotation within your corporate functions, whether that be HR, whether that be compliance, whether that be legal, whether that be information technology, whether it be your internal audit functions. If you have the protocol in place, everyone understands what the process is. And I can't emphasize enough the need for you to have a written process in place. Doesn't mean you can't change your process, doesn't mean you can't expand or contract your process. But just as you would deal with a third party request to hire a new agent, there should be a business justification for changing the process, or if there's an exception granted, why. If you do have an exception to your protocol, you need to document that. So what are the 5 steps? And this comes to us from Jackie Trevino and Jay Martin, the former chief compliance officer. And it's these 5 steps. Number 1, opening and categorizing the case. That encompasses the 5 steps or stages of triage from Jonathan Marks we looked at in the prior slide. 2, planning the investigation, determining the required investigative tasks. 3, executing this. And under this step, the investigation needs to be completed and the report written. 4, determining appropriate follow-up. And here you need to think about oversight. If you are not sure what oversight might be, perhaps my favorite illustration or visual in the world of literature comes to us from the Great Gatsby. And so I say, think of the eyes of T.J. Eckel. Everyone had to read The Great Gatsby in high school. Hopefully it's not on the banned list yet. But if you've read it, you remember the eyes of T.J. Eichelberg. He was an optometrist who had a billboard, and he had a set of eyes with glasses on it. And it was on the highway from Long Island into the city where Tom went in for tryst with his mistress. But the eyes of T.J. Eichelberg. Why are the eyes of T.J. Eichelberg important? Because my wife is a process engineer, and she continually reminds me process without oversight is no process at all. A second set of eyes. And that's what the investigative team really bring when you have, and then when you add that with relevant business unit representatives. And it gives you a chance to put a second set of eyes on the investigative report and then determine appropriate discipline and other actions to take, remedial actions. You could also consider a root cause analysis at this point. Just a word about discipline, please make sure it's consistent. If you fire people in Brazil for cheating on their expense account, and the number 1 sales guy in the United States cheats on his expense account or her expense account, you got to fire him too. But this is the remit really of this committee. And then 5, close the case and communicate the investigative results to stakeholders, including the reporter, if they're not anonymous. So complete the case file and close the case file. In a prior life, I was an insurance defense lawyer, and one of my insurance clients had a little stack of happy stickers. And when he closed a file, he put a happy sticker on it because he said a closed file is a happy file. And so close the file. But you see some rigor in this, and I would ask you to consider, do you have the rigor in your process or in your investigative protocol so that if a regulator comes knocking, or any of the other people I talked about in the opening slide in terms of a subpoena from criminal defense attorneys or the Department of Justice or the Securities and Exchange Commission, you can sit down, you can show them, here is our protocol, and here's each of the steps we took within the protocol, and here's how they're documented. Now, to have all of that in a traditional written file, I think, is gone by the way of something long ago. And this really begs, I think, the need for a case management system, whatever you might choose to use, to have it documented. Because if a regulator calls up and you say it's going to take us 2 weeks to pull all the paper together, then you're not going to be seen as being serious about your compliance program, I don't think. So could we move on to the next?
Yes, we have a couple of questions first. So the first one is, are all public or private entities involved with the federal government required to turn over all investigative materials?
Let me put my compliance hat off, put my legal hat on. Now, even though I have a legal hat on, I'm not your lawyer. I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So you Can't rely on what I'm about to say as legal advice, and I'm not creating an attorney-client privilege or attorney-client relationship with you. Having given all of the appropriate disclaimers I can think of, when you do have to turn over the materials is when you are under investigation or you have voluntarily self-disclosed to the Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, Department of HHS, DOT, whichever one it may be. Once you voluntarily self-disclose, the government is going to expect, remember from the Monaco speech, it's now the Monaco Doctrine, all information that you have. Now, there are certainly, in every investigation, there's attorney-client privilege. If you were my client, remember you're not my client, but if you were my client and I discovered information and disclosed that to you and said, let's look at steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Steps 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 would be attorney work product, came from my head, and then me telling them to you would be communications around my attorney work product. That's also privileged. The facts are never privileged, and you always have to disclose facts, even if they're bad facts. But those are the two types of privilege. You can not turn that over to the Department of Justice, meaning no obligation to do, and the Department of Justice cannot make you disclose attorney-client privileged information. However, if you do disclose that information to the Department of Justice, any other regulator, or anyone else, then the attorney-client privilege does not exist. It's only between the attorney and the client. If you turn it over to a third party, that's where it's now available either through subpoena or other appropriate mechanism to be discovered. And that's where the U.S. versus Coburn case is so significant, because the cognizant technology lawyers and employees turned over information to the Department of Justice. They may have thought it was only going to the Department of Justice, but because of the criminal proceedings now, it's fair game. And you don't have to turn that information over to the Department of Justice or other regulators. But if you do, that destroys any privilege that you have that could have kept, or any privilege claim you could have made. So once you take attorney-client privilege information and turn it over to a third party, whether it's a regulator, whether it's a court, whether it's a newspaper, it doesn't matter. You've abrogated or lost your attorney-client. That's why the need for rigor in your process, and equally important, the documentation of the steps you have taken, is so critical, because that report may not be turned over for 5 years after it's done. And the person who did it may be long gone. Their memories may have been clouded, or not clouded, but they may not remember as well in 5 years. I hope that answers your question. If it didn't quite do it, to just resubmit it. Did you have another one for me, Victoria?
We do have another one. So the next one says, any tips on management disagreement with recommendations of investigators for disciplinary actions?
Yes. Document whatever you do. Just because I might recommend discharge or a lesser penalty, if there is a valid reason, whether it's consistency, whether it's fairness, whether it's a first-time violation, whether it's a seriousness of the violation, as you can have a disagreement. But if you make a recommendation and a recommendation is not accepted, then there needs to be some documented reason for the final decision. If no more questions, how about the next slide? Okay, preparing for the investigation. We're getting close to the investigation. Now, this language comes from the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And this is the Department of Justice speaking. So it's really important that you be able to answer this question. What steps does the company take to ensure the investigations are independent, objective, appropriately conducted, and properly documented? How does the company determine who should conduct the investigation and who makes that determination? If you follow the protocols I've suggested, or if you develop your own protocols, I think this goes a long way towards being able to answer these questions. But you need to have independent objectivity and an appropriate investigation as well, and the document part. Could we move to the next slide? So what are some of the questions I would suggest that you ask if you do get the case that comes in that is stage 4 or stage 5? So does the in-house investigative team have the needed skills to perform the investigation? Do you understand the business environment and the extended business enterprise? How bad are the facts at this point? Legal and financial implications. And then the final point is, and I didn't have this in your protocol, but do you need to alert your crisis management team? So if this comes into the head of HR, if this comes into the general counsel, if this comes into compliance, whether it's committee looking at this, these are some of the questions you want to ask. If it's a bet the company case, you need bet the company lawyers. You need the best outside investigative counsel that you can bring to bear on the situation. Typically, you do not want your regular counsel doing this because that may violate what the Department of Justice says is objective. If your regular counsel that does your corporate work for you handles investigation of a bad set of facts, this may be something that the DOJ said, but they're just beholden to you because you pay them so much money. What I would ask you to think about is, do you have the necessary needed? I was a trial lawyer before I went in-house, so I felt very comfortable doing investigations. A lot of my colleagues had been in-house for most all of their career. They didn't have that background, so they were less comfortable. And it doesn't mean you can't learn them through training, but if you don't have investigative skills, you may want to bring in people who do have investigative skills. Those people do not need to be lawyers. They can be former law enforcement persons. They can be forensically trained fraud examiners. They can be certified fraud examiners. They can be internal auditors, but you need people who are trained to doing investigations. You absolutely have to understand the business environment. And that's where, even if the general counsel or in-house compliance does not lead an investigation, they need to be a resource to outside counsel, and certainly considering the legal and financial implications as early as possible will help you determine who you might want to turn to. If we don't have any more questions, Victoria, could we move to the next slide?
We do have a question. This question says, I've always heard that the answer to the reporter after closing the investigation must be as simple as can be. So, for example, thank you for your report. An investigation has been made and all measures have been taken. Is this enough to prove to an agency that you gave feedback to a reporter?
So I would say the answer to that is no. But I would perhaps rephrase the question or rephrase to whom your obligation is or who you want to satisfy. I'm not as concerned about telling a regulator, hey, we told the reporter what we did. I'm more concerned about making sure the reporter understands the process. There's something called a fair process doctrine, and the fair process doctrine says that if the process is fair, if the process is rigorous, if there is transparency around the process, then the end results, the people who are not perhaps happy with the end results, they're more willing to accept that the process was fair. If you give the reporter that minimal amount of information, you've answered none of those questions. You haven't shown transparency. You haven't shown how the process is fair. You haven't shown the steps you've taken. You haven't kept them involved. And early on in my career in compliance, I was heavily influenced by the following exchange I saw at a compliance conference. And it happened to be in an export control, but you could take it to any area of compliance. There was a federal regulator in the form of an agent from the from OFAC on a panel. And someone from the audience stood up and said, you obviously don't remember me, but 6 years ago, I made a whistleblowing report of criminal conduct at my former employer to you personally. And I've got no feedback since that time. And the agent was clearly put on the spot. He didn't remember the reporter. I don't know if he remembered the case, and they were all he's. They said something like, what's an ongoing investigation, and I'll have somebody get back to you. And that played out probably over 30 to 60 seconds, but the entire room just went dead quiet. And it was so clear the frustration of the reporter with the entity and the person who had received that information that I've always kept that in the back of my mind. If possible, keep your reporters involved. Because remember, 85 to 95% of those reporters who are going to the SEC reported in-house first. And if you simply report back, we have concluded our investigation and taken steps we deem reasonable, and that's not what the reporter wanted or thought should happen, That's the kind of person who could very easily go to the SEC or other federal agency to participate in a bounty. If, however, you detail with them the steps you took in a transparent manner, and we came to this conclusion for these reasons, they still could go to the SEC, but there's much less chance they will.
We do have another question, one more.
All right.
Should this process be consistent in the organization? For instance, if a compliance concern is submitted via the hotline and the investigation is conducted by HR, should the same investigative process be followed throughout the organization?
You should have one investigative protocol throughout your organization. It's not necessarily who sets that protocol. It can be HR, it can be legal, it can be compliance. I hope there would be a collaborative effort so that you get everyone's concerns taken care of in the protocol. But you have to be able to show that you have considered the information, you've investigated, if you have created an exception for any reason, you've documented that exception and the reason why, and then you've documented each of the steps that you have in place. And if you have to document the expertise of the investigator, hopefully you have that on file in terms of their resume or other certificates of training, et cetera. I think it's absolutely mandatory that you have consistency across your organization. Okay, who should be on your investigative team? Here are some of the potential roles. And then, Victoria, after we go through this, I'm going to ask for our next polling question. So who could be on the investigative team? Legal, HR, forensic accounting, compliance, internal control specialist, perhaps outside counsel. And now I think would be a good time to go to the...
All right, I will start up the second poll. All right, so everybody, you are going to see a poll up on your screen. The question is, who should be on your investigative team? And the answers are the following: legal, HR, finance, internal audit, or all of the above. All right, votes are slowing. So the responses are as follows: 6% say legal, 7% say HR, 0% say finance, 4% say internal audit, and 84% say all of the above.
That's an excellent way to think through it, in my opinion. Doesn't mean you have to use all those resources, but I would at least consider all of those for anything serious. So how about the next slide? Okay, who is the ultimate audience? This it may sound counterintuitive to you, but I would ask you to think about, if you're involved in an investigation, who could be the ultimate audience? And what I mean by ultimate audience is the final person or persons who would review your report. Is it going to be senior management? Could it be a board of directors, internal compliance committee? How about a regulator such as the Department of Justice, SEC, or other federal, state, or even city regulator? Or how about in a court of law, a trier of fact? The trier of fact is the ultimate decision maker. Remember that case I keep talking about, U.S. v. Coburn? The ultimate trier of fact in that case is the jury. You need to think about who is going to be the ultimate audience for your report, because if you do think about, that's when I think you will see the need for this rigor around process, and then the case management protocols and the document literally of everything. And as I said, for my sins, I'm a recovering trial lawyer. So for me, the ultimate audience is always the trier of fact, because something can always end up in a lawsuit. You really need to think about, how is your report going to be viewed, and how's it going to be viewed 5 years from now? That Coburn, US v. Coburn, came out of Cognizant Technology, and the investigation in that case started in 2016. And so you have an investigation and report beginning in 2016. It's now 2022, and they may or may not go to trial this year or maybe next year. It could be a long time, and who's going to be the ultimate audience for your report? And the same is true for really any legal issue, certainly harassment or promotion or any other what's viewed as DEI or more traditional HR issue. So how about the next slide? Okay, once again, just to emphasize the Coburn case and why it's so important, all reports made to the government will be turned over to defense counsel, and that means all of your information and all of your thought processes that's reduced to writing in any way. Can you defend your investigation? Can you stand up in a court of law and say, I followed the protocol set out by our investigation and that is documented. You don't have to take my word for it. The documents corroborate my testimony, or my testimony corroborates the documentation that's in my case management system. And that, of course, leads to the three most important things: document, document, document. So we're getting near the end. Do we have any more questions before we go to our last slide, Victoria?
I do have one. Let me pull it up very quickly. Here we go. If you're using or considering using a technology solution to manage your cases, what key features should you look for?
That ties directly into the next slide. So let's just move to that and we'll answer the question. What's the role of a tech solution? Your tech solution is the backbone of your investigative protocol. You set the investigative protocol, then you bring in a tech solution that fleshes that out. Document, you're able to document your not simply collection of a repository of information of whatever real documents you might want to collect, but the documents of your thought process, the documents of the decisions you made to interview witness A, but not witness Z. Doesn't mean either one is right or wrong. You document that. And so you have a recordation of your thought processes. You have a document repository in place, because every time I interview a outside counsel who does investigations for the government, the first question they are asked by the regulators are, do you have the documents tied down? So document repository. Determine if the protocol is followed in real time. If you deviate from your established protocol, hopefully you'll have oversight of your technological solution or your case management solution, and someone can simply ask the question, why? If you have a tech solution that really has all of the steps of your protocol, you can defend each step to regulators. So you've got the protocol, you've got the step, you've got the documentation for each step. I think it's in the ultimate accountability, and I would add transparency if needed. And then the final point we really haven't touched on at all, but probably worthy of an entire webinar on its own, which is analytics for greater insight. I talked about perhaps moving from detection to prevention or reaction to proactive compliance. If you have documented insights from multiple investigations of some issue in a geographic area, some issue specifically in your code of conduct, or some other issue that's popping up, you might want to bring to bear other solutions, additional training, communications, revisions to your internal controls. The solution might be, but if you have a tech solution and specifically a case management solution, the analytics for greater insight that you can get from that could be worth their weight literally in gold. So I think, Victoria, this is the final slide. I'm certainly happy we've got a few minutes left if there are any additional questions, or if there are any additional points that have come up for you, I'm happy to answer them.
I do have a question for you. It says, what about informal notes? What are your thoughts when you talk about them when you say document?
That's a great question, because that speaks directly to one of the key privileges, which is the attorney work product privilege. That's a privilege that relates to what's in your head and what you may put down on your own thought processes. I try to use that to explain why I've made a decision. I gave the example of interviewing witness A, but not witness Z. What was the decision? Why didn't I interview Z? If I have a reason and it's made in good faith, that's probably going to be enough. The government has never, and let me say that word again, never criticized an internal investigation for negligence, or Tom interviewed A but not Z. That was negligent. What they have criticized investigations for is he never considered interviewing A or Z, and they were the two of the most culpable people, or they could have provided additional information. By putting those sorts of thoughts and documenting those, I think it gives a fuller picture and color to what you are doing and your thought process. And I think it adds to both accountability and transparency in your overall program as well. And I'm a huge fan of police procedurals. They have the murder book, or the book where any investigator writes down their findings, because they have multiple investigators coming on board and reviewing. Certainly in a cold case file, you would review notes and thought process of a prior investigator. I think that can be invaluable if others come into the investigation, or if you want to essentially audit an investigation, whether it's a self-audit or an audit by a third party to the scope of your investigation. And did you follow your own protocol as well? I think it's critical to have that information in some types of note section, or your impressions of a witness. How did the things that would go in, not go into the report? You may report on what the witness said, but really you may not more fully report your impressions. I think those can all be critical elements that need to be recorded.
Fantastic. I think there's one more question. I feel like we can probably get to it and then we will wrap. This one says, I have been to trainings where they tell participants to trash all drafts and notes and only keep the final report. Do you think that would lead to problems?
I think it would lead to problems. One, if you're under any kind of order or obligation to keep all documents, that's one. Two, I think it's short-sighted in terms of giving the fullness and richness of a report, because now many people outside your first line intended audience might read the report, and it might, and that's the ultimate audience that I talked about a little bit earlier. I think prior drafts are critical, and it would help someone who's looking at it later understand how you finally got to something. And if you try to limit the amount of information that would go into a final report, what the Department of Justice said, and more importantly, I shouldn't say the DOJ, what the court in the U.S. versus Coburn case said was that even if you make an oral report to the Department of Justice, that still waives your attorney-client privilege. And you have to turn over everything that supported that. So there's really no way to protect that stuff.
Fantastic. All right. I am going to wrap us up.
This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening to this special episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you'd like more information on any of the topics I've touched on in this podcast, shoot me an email as I have a white paper on this topic. This special presentation has been a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.